They praised the work, the beauty, the perfection, but they never saw me, the woman behind the lens, the soul behind every frame. For 25 years, I stayed invisible, forgotten, silenced. I watched them take everything, my credit, my fame, my life, until the day I chose to step out of the shadows, until now. My name is Laura Gaines. People only ever saw the work, not the woman. For 25 years, the world praised the Gaines brand, throwing million-dollar contracts and celebrity magazine covers at our doorstep. Those stark, haunting black and white photos, the ones that could just about tear your heart out, those were mine. They came straight out of my eye, my soul, and the steady grip of my own hands. But the one who stepped into the spotlight, the one who accepted the awards, shook the famous hands, and signed on the bottom line for the life we lived, that was Daniel. He was magnificent, seriously, handsome, smooth, and utterly brilliant at sounding important. He was the visionary, the master curator, the creative director. At least that's what he convinced the world, and, more cruelly, almost convinced me. I was the shy artist who hated the fuss. He became my front man, then my filter, and finally, my cage. Just stay behind the scenes, doll. The camera is your weapon. I am your shield, he'd declare, adjusting his perfect suit before he strutted out to meet the press. Over time, that shield became a steel wall, trapping me in the back studio while he enjoyed all the sunshine and fame my hard-won talent had earned. He controlled the money, the contracts, the calendar, and the narrative. My name, Laura, was gradually reduced to a footnote on a check, payable to Gaines Media Ltd. My creative life was systematically minimized into the category of raw production assets. He treated my artistic soul like high-end plumbing, essential to the house, but invisible unless it burst. The pain wasn't just financial theft, it was the slow, continuous execution of my identity. I started forgetting who I was. The moment he'd claimed the creative credit for a massive museum show that was entirely my composition, I would just swallow the fury and retreat to the silent refuge of the darkroom. I stayed partly because, under his cynical protection, my work reached levels I never could alone. But mostly, I stayed because the sheer emotional effort of confronting the lie, of blowing up the perfectly curated Gaines brand in a vicious public divorce, felt harder than simply absorbing the daily poisonous dosage of his disrespect. But 50 brought a change. My hands finally fed up, stopped clicking. My creativity dried up. I had reached a breaking point where the price of keeping the peace outweighed the cost of all-out war. The divorce papers were drawn up, confidential bank boxes filled with every expense account forgery and fraudulent claim Daniel had executed, proving the scope of his theft. The entire archive was proof of his fraud against me and the IRS. My attorney had everything. I just needed Daniel to come home from his business trip so I could hand him the served papers and begin my final, massive photo session, a full-frame exposure of his decades of lies.
The solitude here is complete. The only noise is the gentle hiss of old ventilation and the low, muffled echo of planes landing hundreds of feet above me, ghosts of metal I'm no longer allowed to guide. The work is designed to drive me mad. Just me, the screen, the archives, and my overwhelming grief. I tried to tell everyone about the sound, the faint stutter, the microscopic static. I insisted it was the source of my distraction. I tried to pull the archived Flight 901 audio and focus solely on those 2 seconds before rotation to isolate the phantom sound and prove it was real. But the official inquiry report sealed that log forever, categorized under Level 7 confidentiality. The sound I heard, the sound that shattered my life and the lives of those ground workers, was protected, invisible, and legally dismissed as a delusion. My husband, Arthur, tries his best. He calls me every evening, asking me what I audited that day, pretending to care about the inventory of logs. But his eyes, when he sees me now, are filled with a grief and confusion that matches my own. He can't look at me without seeing the operator who failed. The insurance company and the civil lawsuits forced us to sell our perfect house. My beautiful life evaporated to cover a fraction of the cost. I caused it. And I now spend every quiet, suffocating hour of my retirement proving to myself that I was the operator who deserved the ruin. My daily routine became a morbid ritual of professional penance. I spent countless hours archiving old, insignificant conversations, 1995 traffic flow analysis, 2002 weather updates, hoping to drown my guilt in pointless, bureaucratic noise. My only distraction was the meticulous nature of the task. Logging timestamps, transcribing half phrases, correcting ambient microphone distortion, and administrator of auditory waste. But then, almost 3 months into my new punishment, the subtle noise of the reconciliation chamber started to change. I noticed patterns, ghosting. While auditing tapes from the mid-2000s, conversations so dull they were designed to sedate me, I started picking up the faint echo of another signal behind the one I was supposed to be transcribing. It was a faint, nearly supersonic hiss, a high-frequency overlayer running behind the expected main channel audio. It was barely detectable, a noise so far outside the standard vocal range that only an ear hyper-tuned by decades of extreme auditory concentration could ever pick it up. My ear. The ear that they said had hallucinated the key failure on Flight 901. My trauma suddenly became my tool. I wasn't listening to noise. I was listening to the shadows behind the audio. This was no accident. The faint overlayer only occurred on certain highly critical archive logs, specific air traffic clearances, especially those involving government contracts or unscheduled high-security departures. I began to categorize the overlayer. I developed a system, my own ciphers of the silent signal, tracking the moments the ghostly hiss appeared. This was no mere static. It was an orchestrated, subtle intrusion. It proved that a secondary recording mechanism, an illicit system operating outside the FAA's knowledge, was at one point actively listening to or feeding information back into the air traffic network, and only on sensitive lines. Someone or something was running an operation within my network of control, a deliberate, decades-long breach. The blood went cold in my veins. My operator error on Flight 901, the blip, the static chirp, the momentary lapse of concentration that ended so many lives, suddenly took on a new, horrifying dimension. I hadn't failed. I had been a casualty of an internal sabotage operation, the subtle audio fingerprint of the surveillance network being temporarily overridden or malfunctioning just as the plane was moving. It wasn't my memory that was faulty. It was the entire network that was compromised. And they knew it. The people who had destroyed my life, who relegated me to this auditory purgatory, the inquiry board, the investigators, Mr. Haas, they had not merely made an error. They had conducted the perfect cleanup job, sacrificing me as the public scapegoat to protect their hidden, decades-old breach of security. I felt the immense weight of the injustice of the universe compress into a single, white-hot, singular resolve. I had to prove it. But I couldn't risk revealing my knowledge, not yet. The forces that buried the truth of Flight 901 were not just corporate figures. They were shadowy operators protecting a profound breach in national security. They would stop at nothing to eliminate the final, living loose end. The woman in the dark room with the perfect ears. I had become the architect of the final audit. My crime wasn't error, it was knowing too much. And now my relentless task was clear: to weaponize the auditory waste I was assigned to manage, piece together the cipher of the silent signal, and expose the perpetrators before the ghosts of the runway consumed my final dignity. I knew I couldn't access the 901 archive legally, but every other log I was transcribing was potentially a piece of that very same puzzle. I was the ghost who listened to ghosts, and this time the world was going to hear me. The silence, so long my torturer, was now my sanctuary. My assignment, the archival of obsolete, irrelevant communication logs, was never meant to be solved. It was punishment, a slow auditory drain designed to ensure my complete disappearance. But the faint, persistent overlayer signal, the sonic footprint of the secret network that proved my innocence, transformed this cold room into a control center. My job became my shield. I became the master weaver of waste. The task of piecing together the cipher of the silent signal required a new level of surgical mental discipline. The high-frequency hiss didn't transmit data like normal voices. It was a digital heartbeat, a meta-signal, indicating the exact times and duration the illicit listening/transmission devices were active. I cross-referenced the signal's appearance with the operational context of the audited logs, using the sheer randomness of the 30-year archive to hide my focus. When I was logging hours of trivial traffic pattern adjustments, my mind was busy documenting the subtle electronic pulses that proved someone was always listening. I found my main suspects quickly. They weren't strangers. They were my old life. Mr. Vernon Haas, the head of my internal review board and the architect of my career execution, was my immediate target. I remembered the cold, clinical finality of his signature on my firing notice, and the way he'd advocated for my new auditing position with the chilling enthusiasm of a jailer. His final assessment of my conduct was riddled with unnecessary and legally self-protective adjectives. Inexplicable, isolated, uncharacteristic. He wasn't describing an error. He was establishing a firewall of plausible deniability around the network. My focus quickly shifted to the tapes from 2005 to 2015. Here, the signal intensified, especially around the approval of certain new IT system infrastructure contracts. I saw 3 key names repeated across the logs whenever the overlayer signal was strongest. Haas, John Peterson, the lead IT architect for a series of sensitive hardware upgrades that decade, and a man named Dr. Adrian Royce, an obscure communications expert whose presence on internal documents only appeared after major upgrades. These men were the triumvirate of silence. They hadn't just used the glitch to destroy my concentration on Flight 901. They had built the very flaw that shattered my life. I realized I couldn't trust Arthur anymore. He was suffering too much. My husband was my greatest vulnerability, the one place my cold determination could be thawed by pity or accident. I pulled away, gently, brutally, using my overwhelming work burden and my emotional difficulty with the tapes as my cover. It was agonizing. A professional sacrifice of my only personal life, but necessary. The triumvirate didn't want a villain. They wanted a ghost. I couldn't risk them weaponizing my personal relationships. I created 2 copies of my running audit, each on encrypted external hard drives. I nicknamed the documents Alpha Archive, all audio transcripts and timelines, and Omega Archive, my specific notation cipher of the overlayer signal and cross-referenced suspect data. I stored the 2 drives in 2 geographically distant locations that only I knew, my version of digital disaster insurance. As my shadow work continued, the isolation of the reconciliation chamber began to warp. The silence turned into a suffocating echo chamber of guilt. I became obsessed with listening to myself lie, to Arthur, to my conscience, and, most terrifyingly, to my own official inquiry testimony years ago, which now felt like the babbling of a lost, naive fool. My guilts over the lost lives, 13 innocent maintenance workers, no longer focused on my supposed error, but on my failure to grasp the full extent of the conspiracy that killed them. The weight of 901's ruin no longer drove me toward regret, but toward righteous, bone-deep fury. I started experiencing subtle countermeasures designed to erode my control. Haas was still monitoring my penance. The air conditioning unit, my single companion, began to flicker, creating irregular, low-frequency hums designed to mimic the signal I was documenting. Then entire folders on my hard drive, logs I'd spent days on, would appear corrupted or be randomly recategorized, a digital tampering too specific to be a hardware failure. Haas wasn't passively observing my slow disappearance. He was actively gaslighting the ghost to accelerate my madness. They wanted me to confess, not to their conspiracy, but to my self-inflicted guilt. I understood his logic. The most elegant destruction isn't external. It's making the target believe they are broken. My perfection became my undoing. My professional pride couldn't admit to technical error, and my personal suffering prevented me from admitting hallucination. I realized the full psychological torture of my assignment. He wasn't punishing my career. He was weaponizing my meticulous nature against my own mind. My focus became absolute. Find the definitive link between the cipher of the silent signal and the one thing they locked away, Flight 901's official final communication log. The official 901 log was under Level 7 confidentiality, accessible only via a specific, complex password stored in the physical log cabinet located in a secure wing known as the Iron Room. This entire part of the operation, I learned in a flash of terrifying clarity, was run by a keyless fingerprint security access system. A quick dive into the archives I was allowed access to gave me my answer. A completely insignificant 20-year-old internal facilities management document, hardware system manual for Sentry-safe locks. A paragraph dedicated to the now-retired Iron Room's access policy revealed the secret. The system recorded the fingerprint images, but kept a specific, encrypted, low-resolution copy of the print on a legacy data stream intended for backup in case of biometric sensor failure. The fingerprint was there, logged and archived. I focused on the personnel records. The Iron Room policy dictated that 2 board members, Hawes and his predecessor, were required to provide physical access signatures every 2 weeks to log tape removals. Hawes' signature was still required. I located his fingerprint image, a slightly blurred thumbprint taken from an old facilities entry memo I was auditing that week. I copied the image digitally and stored it deep within my Omega archive, waiting for the moment to bypass the system that buried my name. This was no longer just about proving my innocence. It was about taking down a systemically corrupt structure from within. A breach of aviation and national security they had kept silent for 30 years, using people like me as the sacrifice. The triumvirate had made a fatal miscalculation. They never accounted for the fact that a truly diligent archivist finds everything. The irony of being framed for an oral hallucination by a surveillance architect who depended on a flaw I was currently auditing was unbearable. But the real unthinkable twist lay in the sheer number of victims. The overlayer signal was running on hundreds of hours of current log material as well. This wasn't an archive cleanup. The illegal listening and intrusion system was still active. It hadn't stopped after my disgrace. It had merely been shielded by my dismissal. The danger was ongoing. The conspiracy was operational and expanding. And the final piece of the terror? I found 2 tapes in the unindexed logs I was never meant to audit. A casual lunch conversation from 4 years ago between Peterson, IT architect, and an unknown voice. The unknown voice said, "The Mitchell problem is solved. The audio proof of our field test is destroyed, and the spouse is now manageable." My blood turned to ice. The spouse, Arthur. They hadn't just destroyed me. They had a separate file on my life outside the tower. The emotional trauma I had weaponized as a personal shield was an object of professional scrutiny for the triumvirate of silence. My life, the sale of the house, the grief, the retreat, was logged, filed, and considered manageable. The shame was that I had let Arthur bear that monitored guilt alone for 6 years. My greatest protection was their weapon. I felt the immense wave of professional cruelty wash over me, the deliberate psychological terror. They were monitoring my breakdown and recording it. I had become the living embodiment of their system of surveillance, filed away and audited for internal review. My determination turned into absolute ice-cold certainty. Arthur's life was now also a piece of evidence. I had to destroy their whole structure. The ultimate betrayal was now my single-minded target. I moved forward into the most dangerous phase, leveraging my discovered secrets and preparing the trap for Haas, using the Iron Room key and my own life as bait. The isolation of the reconciliation chamber was over. The chilling truth that the triumvirate, Haas, Peterson, and Royce, had deliberately weaponized my emotional breakdown, monitoring my and Arthur's grief, extinguished any remaining fear I held. My goal was no longer justice. It was a devastating, total annihilation of the system they built, a system fueled by corruption and grounded by the 13 lives lost on Flight 901. My key lay in a paradox. I had to commit a security violation using the triumvirate's own biometric system to retrieve the one audio file they destroyed to prove my innocence. I planned the act with the cool precision of a professional operator making a perfect emergency landing. My first action was simple but psychologically essential, severing the controlled vulnerability. I packed a bag and left my small, depressing apartment, leaving a short note for Arthur. It read, "The truth is worse than you imagined. Don't trust any calls. You will understand soon. Don't contact me. I love you, but this has to be silent. C." This single intentional silence destroyed their ability to monitor me through my known emotional vulnerability. My grief was officially retired as a useful tool. The time for action was late Friday evening, the moment when vigilance is lowest. I accessed the restricted perimeter near the Iron Room through a maintenance access route that only an unobtrusive administrative compliance officer would know. I carried 3 items: my worn administrator ID, useless for physical entry, essential for appearing lost, a highly sophisticated mobile scanning kit disguised inside an oversized coffee travel mug, and the digital archive containing Haas's low-resolution thumbprint, Omega Archive. The Iron Room itself was located on the deep sublevel, a vault of security tapes and audios designed for maximum containment. The only access was the obsolete but highly encrypted biometric system. I used the access panel of a nearby unused server rack as my workbench. I transferred Haas's thumbprint image from the Omega Archive to a specialized translucent film, a trick I'd read about in one of the facility's logs years ago. Then, using my coffee mug's disguised scanner as a power conduit, I initiated the protocol. My old ID badge served as a mask. If caught, I was merely the lonely administrator who, due to emotional stress, was attempting to retrieve sentimental audit files that needed re-verification. They would assume madness. I was conducting surgery. The system blinked. A single, triumphant, but quiet beep. Access granted. The Iron Room was dark and cavernous, rows upon rows of tape cabinets, the collective voice of the control tower for 30 years. I didn't search long. My brain, the only navigational device I needed, guided me directly to cabinet B4, shelf 5. I located the official master log, precisely sealed FL901, final contact, level 7, seal. The lock was not physical. It was an electronic archival key lock, and I had already located the decryption override key on the main administrative drive weeks ago. I slid the 901 archive tape from its metal sheath. The entire log, the seconds of silence, the chaotic aftermath, was now mine. My goal was singular, to surgically isolate the phantom sound not on my system, but on the network itself, making its origin irrefutable. I uploaded the tape onto the main administrative server through a bypass port I'd discovered in my audit work, a secret upload designated not under my name, but under the internal service code Project Thumbtack. My heart, having been slow beating and mechanical for 6 years, was now hammering an impossible rhythm against my ribs. I applied my final auditory analysis to the digital tape right there, in the darkness of the sub-level room. I wasn't listening for static. I was running a cross-reference for the specific high-frequency cipher of the silent signal, the ghostly acoustic watermark that proved an intrusion device was running, against the precise 2-second lapse in my voice log. The screen confirmed the analysis in cold, terrifying data. The phantom chirp I heard that fateful morning was the exact electronic decay signature of the illegal listening device attempting to power down. A momentary spike in white noise as the covert surveillance operation temporarily shorted out and lost containment in the tower console. My distraction was real, planted, and a direct act of sabotage. They didn't just sabotage the network. They performed an audible warning of failure. And they made sure only one person would hear it and be blamed. In the midst of this professional confirmation, the true, unexpected, gut-wrenching trauma surfaced. I found 2 files linked to the 901 crash outside the master archive. Tapes titled Mitchell A, Subject Log 4, and Mitchell A, Behavioral Assessment. My trauma was about to be completed. I hadn't just sacrificed my love, I had betrayed him to their silent surveillance. I loaded the Mitchell A files. The voice was cold, academic, utterly without conscience. Dr. Adrian Royce. Subject is reacting predictably to imposed stress protocol. Financial ruin and social disgrace have proven effective external catalysts. Monitor for sign of intellectual breakthrough on 901 anomaly. Prediction, self-incrimination via guilt. They were watching me for 6 years. They were logging my husband's grief to predict my next mental move. They weren't just the cause of my fall. They were the directors of my misery. I stood there paralyzed not by fear of discovery, but by the sheer, crushing evil of it all. My redemption became instantly irrelevant. My priority was utter annihilation. My emotional composure fractured. I needed a human sacrifice to complete my plan. A name on the audit needed a face to bear the shame. Vernon Haas. I sent a brief, urgent text using an anonymous burner phone and the security system's internal network to bypass typical logs to Mr. Vernon Haas's encrypted work phone. Log 901 access breach. East Foyer, sublevel. Sub-admin attempting log integrity verification. Immediate attendance required. Code, Thumbtack. Haas's ambition guaranteed his appearance. He wouldn't risk having any security administrator verifying the system without his knowledge. He would have to expose his control to stop the audit. He arrived 15 minutes later, out of breath, alone, his security jacket haphazardly buttoned. His face was twisted with the immediate, visceral recognition that his perfect plan was unraveling. He expected to find a timid junior guard. He found the woman he had sent into the abyss. "Clara, what in God's name are you doing here?" His whisper was sharp, laced with genuine terror. I remained calm,
I didn't hide the coffee mug scanner or the official open master archive cabinet. I just held up the 901 log tape, clearly labeled and visibly compromised. I came to do the one piece of reconciliation you couldn't trust yourself to finish, Mr. Haas. His mask of authority dissolved into panicked greed. He lunged for the tape, snarling, the precise lack of control he always punished in others. You suicidal fool, give me that tape. You will sign a total confession of paranoia and destroy your own reputation, or I will ensure your family. I let the threat hang. It was useless now. The sound of his fear was my definitive proof. I wasn't interested in the tape. The audio had already been digitally copied and broadcast. In a carefully staged action, I pushed a silent button under my workbench, an external line dial I'd spliced into the Iron Room's secure intercom. This single action did two things. It activated the Level 7 lockdown alarm, sealing the room instantly with us inside, and simultaneously broadcast Haas's live admission of panic and his attempt to destroy evidence to a carefully pre-selected email distribution list. The lead FBI contact for organized fraud, identified through my Omega archive data, a high-profile investigative journalist I had been tracking for 2 months, and most crucially, Arthur's cell phone number, programmed for voice-to-text recording.
It's too late, Mr. Haas. The tape is secured, I said, moving away from his grasping hands. But my voice log is active now, on the main system. The final audit of Flight 901 is underway. You framed me for psychological unsuitability because you and Dr. Royce planted a bug, causing the crash to justify a funding request for a system update you personally benefited from. I didn't fail the 13 workers who died on the ground. You murdered them for a contract payout. The sheer horror of his failure consumed Haas. The realization that I had played him into the one trap he could not escape, the confined Iron Room broadcast to the external world, his entire life ruined by the despised ghost, shattered his control completely. He stumbled, collapsing against a metal rack in absolute defeated terror. He was the self-caught monster. I waited only until I heard the faint shriek of security teams rushing toward the sublevel and the electronic click on my burner phone that confirmed the external data transmissions were complete. My final act was simple. I unlocked the Iron Room access manually, pushed the trembling, ruined man out of the containment, and then sealed the door shut again, locking myself inside the secure area with the corrupted logs as evidence. I calmly waited for the legitimate authorities, the FBI, the security, the press, and the justice I now controlled. The arrest of the triumvirate was immediate and overwhelming. My detailed, precise auditory audit, coupled with Haas's terrified life confession, left no room for doubt. The evidence revealed the sophisticated, decades-long security conspiracy to leverage national air traffic safety for corporate and private gain. The ghost had made an airtight case. Arthur and I didn't reconnect easily. He called me in a confused, shattered voice, the voice I had feared would ruin my plan, now saved by the sacrifice I made. Clara, those tapes, the names, I don't understand. Are you safe? I explained the truth, not about my heroism, but about their betrayal. He never questioned my decision to go silent. He simply told me he was moving to a remote area, a small place outside the reach of the news and the corruption. I rejected every job offer, every plaque, every title, all the things I'd been working for all my life. I had achieved the only form of professional and personal liberation that mattered: undisputed final authority. My integrity had survived the total failure of my career and the annihilation of my past. My only compensation, secured by a complex settlement arranged through Marcus, was a substantial fortune transferred offshore, a fund that guaranteed my perfect disappearance. I gave Arthur his portion, and I took mine. Today, Clara Mitchell is technically dead to the system, a civilian with a full, quiet life. I travel constantly, residing for months at a time in places that have no airports, only quiet hills. The trauma of the control tower will always live within me, but the years I spent auditing that silence ultimately led me to the only perfect answer. Silence isn't empty. It's the safest place to plot your reckoning. My life now is controlled only by the internal, clean clock of my own timing. I am the retired, free woman who proved that an administrator who knows where all the secrets are filed is infinitely more powerful than the generals who think they own the war.